She looked at me, didn't even blink, and said, "Everything is signed. The house is gone. Deal with it." That was the moment I realized my 17-year marriage hadn't just cracked. It had been quietly dismantled behind my back. And when she told me to deal with it, I did. Just not in the way she or my worst enemy ever imagined. My name is Daniel, I'm 44 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed loyalty and consistency were enough to keep a marriage alive. I worked as a logistics operations manager for a regional shipping company in Raleigh, North Carolina, a job that rewarded patience, attention to detail, and the ability to think 3 steps ahead. Ironically, those same skills are the reason I didn't end up homeless after what my wife did. My wife, Marissa, and I met in our mid-20s. We were young, broke, and convinced we were smarter than everyone else who'd already divorced. She worked in event planning back then, full of energy and ambition, always talking about building something bigger. I admired that about her. For years, it felt like we were a team, 2 people pushing in the same direction, even when life got heavy. The house came into our lives during year 8 of the marriage. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. A modest 2-story place with a narrow driveway, aging hardwood floors, and a backyard that looked better in our imagination than in reality. We signed the papers together, toasted with cheap champagne on the kitchen counter, and talked about growing old there. At least, I did. For a long time, things were stable. Not exciting, not romantic like the early years, but solid. The kind of marriage where bills are paid on time, routines settle in, and you assume silence. I didn't notice when that silence slowly turned into distance, when conversations became transactional, and affection felt scheduled rather than natural. The first real shift happened after Marissa changed social circles. She started spending more time with a new group from work, people I barely knew but heard about constantly. Dinners became networking events. Weekends turned into team retreats. When I asked questions, she brushed them off like I was being insecure. "You wouldn't get it," she'd say. That phrase started popping up a lot, and every time she said it, something in me tightened. One name came up more than the others. Elliot. He wasn't a co-worker. He was a friend of a friend, someone Marissa met through those work connections. From what she told me, he was successful, outspoken, and, according to her, brutally honest. I didn't like him from the start, mostly because he always seemed to know too much about our marriage, despite barely knowing me. Elliot had history with me, whether Marissa realized it or not. Years earlier, before my marriage, he and I had been involved in the same failed business venture. When things went south, he blamed me publicly and privately. We parted on bad terms, and the last time I'd seen him, he told me I'd eventually pay for ruining his momentum. I never imagined he'd circle back into my life through my own wife. Around that time, Marissa began pulling away in ways that were impossible to ignore. She started sleeping in the guest room, claiming my snoring was unbearable. She guarded her phone like it contained state secrets. Our conversations became short, cold, and purely functional. Who was paying which bill? Who was picking up groceries? Who was responsible for the dog that suddenly felt like the only thing still loyal to me? I tried to address it calmly. I suggested counseling. I suggested time away together. I even suggested I might be part of the problem. She responded with indifference, sometimes irritation. "You're always overthinking," she'd say. "Nothing is wrong. Stop creating drama." I wanted to believe her, so I did what a lot of people do. I ignored my instincts and trusted someone who had already stopped protecting our marriage. The gossip started quietly, the way poison usually does. I didn't hear it directly at first. I felt it. Marissa began watching me differently, like she was observing rather than living with me. Simple things triggered sharp reactions. If I stayed late at work, she'd ask who I was really with. If I checked my phone, she'd glance over, eyes narrowing. It was as if a narrative had already been written, and she was just waiting for confirmation. One night, she finally said it out loud. We were standing in the kitchen, the house unusually silent, and she asked, "Is there something you want to tell me?" Her tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory. When I asked what she meant, she hesitated, then accused me of hiding money, of talking to someone behind her back, of planning an exit without her. None of it made sense, but she said it with conviction, like she'd rehearsed the lines. I demanded to know where this was coming from. She hesitated again, then said, People talk. That's when Elliot's name resurfaced, not as a casual mention, but as a source. According to Marissa, Elliot had heard things about me through mutual connection. He'd warned her, she said, that I wasn't as transparent as I pretended to be, that I'd done similar things before, that I was capable of betrayal. I was stunned, not just by the accusations, but by how easily she accepted them. 17 years together, and a rumor from someone who openly disliked me carried more weight than my word. When I defended myself, she accused me of gaslighting. When I asked for proof, she said I was deflecting. Every response I gave somehow became evidence against me. That's when the emotional distance turned into something colder. She stopped including me in decisions, stopped sharing plans, stopped asking my opinion about anything related to the house. Looking back, I realize now that while I was trying to save the marriage, she was already preparing to move on, armed with half-truths, outside influence, and a growing sense of moral superiority. The night everything collapsed didn't come with yelling or drama. It came with paperwork. Marissa asked me to sit down at the dining table like we were about to discuss grocery lists. Instead, she placed a thick folder in front of me, neatly organized, color-coded, and terrifyingly final. That's when she said the sentence that ended up, "I'm done fighting for this marriage. Everything is signed." At first, I genuinely didn't understand what she meant. I thought she was talking about a separation agreement, maybe divorce papers she'd prepared without telling me. As much as that hurt, it still made sense. But then she clarified, her voice flat and strangely calm. She had sold the house, our house, and she hadn't asked for my consent because, in her words, you would have tried to stop it. When I asked who the buyer was, she hesitated for just a second too long. Then she said Elliot's name. Not casually, almost defiantly. She explained that he was a serious investor, that he'd offered a fast, clean deal, and that he understood her situation. According to her, Elliot believed I was unstable, manipulative, and dangerous to her financial future. And she believed him. I felt something inside me go completely still. Rage would have been easier. Shock would have made more sense. Instead, there was clarity. Because suddenly, every strange conversation, every whisper, every cold look lined up perfectly. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. And she hadn't just believed a rumor. She'd let it guide one of the biggest decisions of our lives. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I simply looked at her and said, "Okay." That confused her more than anger ever would have. She expected a reaction, a breakdown, maybe even begging. Instead, I stood up, grabbed a few essentials, and left the house without another word. As I drove away, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the one who had just lost everything. That night, I checked into a cheap motel off the highway, the kind with thin walls and flickering lights, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. My phone buzzed a few times, texts from Marissa asking where I'd gone, telling me we needed to talk like adults. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and started doing what I do best, verifying facts. If my house had really been sold, there would be a trail. By morning, I'd already found my first inconsistency. There was no pending transfer filed with the county recorder's office, no preliminary change of ownership, no escrow record under our address. That didn't mean nothing was happening. It meant something was being rushed. Sloppily. I called in sick to work and made an appointment with a real estate attorney recommended by a co-worker who'd survived a brutal divorce the year before. The attorney, Ms. Calloway, listened quietly as I laid everything out. The rumors, Elliot's involvement, the signed documents Marissa claimed were final. When I finished, she asked a single question that shifted the entire conversation. "Did you personally sign any documents authorizing the sale?" I told her no, not a single one. She nodded slowly, like someone who'd just spotted a crack in a dam. She explained that even if Marissa had signed something, it didn't automatically make the sale valid. Both owners had to consent, and any attempt to bypass that could invalidate the entire transaction, or worse, expose the buyer and seller to serious legal consequences. When I mentioned Elliot's name, her expression hardened. "That changes things," she said, "especially if there's intent." By the end of the meeting, we had a plan. I was to stay silent, No more contact with Marissa, no confrontations with Elliot. Let them believe I was confused, defeated, overwhelmed. Meanwhile, she would file a notice to block any unauthorized sale and begin requesting copies of every document tied to the supposed transaction. As I walked back to my car, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. The next 2 weeks were some of the quietest and most revealing of my life. I went to work, kept my head down, and returned each night to the motel like a ghost passing through someone else's room. Marissa didn't come looking for me. Instead, she sent carefully worded messages that alternated between guilt and superiority. She said she was protecting herself, that I'd forced her hand, and that I should be grateful she'd handled things cleanly. Meanwhile, Ms. Calloway uncovered exactly how unclean everything was. The documents Marissa believed were final turned out to be preliminary drafts, unsigned by me, unrecorded, and legally useless. Worse, Elliot had attempted to fast-track the sale using pressure tactics and misleading language, banking on Marissa's emotional state and my silence. In legal terms, it wasn't just unethical, it was reckless. The real turning point came when we discovered email exchanges between Elliot and a third party, messages that openly discussed how to move the property before Daniel wakes up. Reading those words felt surreal. This wasn't about business or opportunity, it was personal. Elliot wasn't buying a house, he was trying to take something from me out of spite, using my own marriage as leverage. Armed with that evidence, my attorney filed a formal legal notice disputing the sale and warning of litigation for interference and attempted fraud. Copies went to Elliot, his company, and Marissa. The effect was immediate. Elliot's tone shifted from confident to defensive. Marissa went silent. For the first time since this began, they realized I wasn't confused or beaten. I was prepared. A few days later, Marissa finally asked to meet. Not to apologize, but to clear the air. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, strangers now. She said she felt manipulated, that she'd trusted the wrong people. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her calmly that trust doesn't collapse because of gossip. It collapses because someone chooses to believe it over their partner. Her eyes filled with tears. Mine didn't. The confrontation with Elliot happened a week later, not in private, but in a conference room with lawyers present and documents spread across the table. He tried to play it off at first, smiling, joking, calling it all a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion. That confidence disappeared the moment my attorney laid out the evidence, the emails, the timelines, the attempted pressure on Marissa, and the clear intent to bypass my consent. Elliot stopped talking. His lawyer started whispering. That was the moment the power shifted. Elliot backed out of the deal entirely, not out of morality, but out of fear. Fear of lawsuits, fear of exposure, fear that his investor reputation would collapse under scrutiny. The house was never transferred. The sale was officially void. And suddenly, the man who thought he'd won was scrambling to protect himself from consequences he never anticipated. Marissa didn't fare much better. When she realized Elliot had abandoned her, the second things got real, something in her finally broke. She called me crying, saying she'd been used, that she felt stupid, that she wanted to come home and fix what was left. But there was nothing left to fix. 17 years doesn't end because of paperwork, it ends because of choices. And hers were already made. I moved back into the house alone. I changed the locks, repainted the walls, and removed every trace of a life built on assumptions instead of trust. Over time, I rebuilt more than just the space. I rebuilt myself. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected, focused on my health, and slowly allowed peace back into my daily routine. Marissa, last I heard, was renting a small apartment and no longer speaking to Elliot, who had quietly disappeared from the circles he once dominated. Looking back, I don't feel anger anymore, just clarity. Gossip didn't destroy my marriage. Belief without loyalty did. She told me everything was signed and to deal with it. And I did. I dealt with it by protecting myself, by refusing to beg, and by choosing a future where my life couldn't be sold out from under me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. It's simply living well after someone thought they'd erased you.